for at least the past year, John, Katie, and I have been trying to figure out how we can address the pervasive problem that so many of us have. I guess it fits pervasive. That means so many of us have it. Of feeling lost at sea when it comes to news. It comes at us through our social media feeds. It comes at us through Yahoo. It comes at us through the television, through YouTube when we're looking for a video on cooking. Like, there are all these news outlets and all these stories, and it is so hard for us to know what's reliable and what's not, who to trust and who not to trust, who's biased and where they're biased. And we keep talking about, like, what would a healthy media diet be? Like, how much news should we be looking at? What news should we be looking at? For what reason? And we just couldn't find somebody to guide us. And we would keep coming back to it, and we wouldn't find anyone. And about a month ago, John said, I think I know who we should have. I don't know if we'll be able to get her. But there's this woman named Vanessa Otero who created in 2016, kind of in response to the craziness of that political climate, something called the Media Bias Chart, which you could see at mediabiaschart.com. And he said, I don't know if we'll be able to get her, but she would be the person that could guide us. And in a classic case of you never know unless you ask, we asked. And she said, sure, I'd love to come and talk to you. And I'm going to share with you this interview. And it's really good. She's so smart and warm and kind. And it turns out that she's also an interesting person just in her own life, not just a news nerd. But before you listen to this interview, I really want to encourage you, if you have access to a device, which you must if you're listening to this podcast, stop and go look up mediabiaschart.com. You'll see the chart. It's just one chart. She does it every year. She did the first one all by herself, and now she has like 40 people analyzing this stuff, putting it together with her. People on the left, people on the right, people in the center, helping her to rate like every news outlet you could imagine and a bunch you've never even heard of on their reliability and on their bias. And it's so much easier if you've seen it. You'll know what we're talking about. And I think you'll like what we're talking about. And so, very seldom do I say, like, for the subject we want to talk about, we found the perfect guest. But oh my goodness, I just enjoyed this conversation a lot. And when it's over and you're like, but where are those 10 newsletter suggestions, or where's this, where's that? Don't worry. Like, look at the show notes. We'll have all that stuff there. I don't even know if I'm going to see you on the other side of this one. Like, this is just a conversation that by the end of it, you'll know exactly where we're at. And so all I'm going to have to say on the other side is, I hope you dug it. And so go dig it. Well, Vanessa, one thing you're going to figure out really fast is that, like, I watched you on some really kind of cool, heady, thoughtful news outlets, and I thought, this is a different podcast.
All right.
Because we're not a news thing. We are not ripped from the headlines. This isn't even a news analysis thing. The folks, I don't know if you're at all familiar, but like the folks who listen to this show are mostly people who grew up in evangelical Christianity.
Cool.
And at some point in their life deconverted.
I did read that part of the background, and I'm excited to talk about that because I know a little bit about that. And
do you? Well, you live in Colorado, so.
Well, I live in Colorado, and I was raised Lutheran, and went to a small Lutheran school for elementary school, and I went to UCLA, and I identified as a Christian when I got to campus. And one of my first experiences, the first week of college, was like getting recruited by evangelical Christian student groups. And I was like,
Yeah.
they're like, "Oh, you're a Christian." I'm like, "Yeah." And so I got
But
sucked
what
into some
brand?
I got sucked into some clubs and realized that it got pretty evangelical pretty quickly, and I'm not there anymore, so I don't need to go into that like whole story, but I can if you want. But I know a lot of Bible verses and songs from when I grew up as a child. I know a lot of praise songs. Like I've got that like cultural knowledge. uh,
Yeah.
so so, if you busted out a praise song, I would probably know it. And
Hallelujah.
and but that helps me connect with folks who are still, evangelical Christians.
Well, and I mean, two things that are really interesting to me about that story is, first of all, a Lutheran showing up at UCLA. Lutheran is kind of evangelical light. Like,
Right. It wasn't super it wasn't my church that I grew up in wasn't evangelical at all, not really political at all. Pretty laid back. I mean, Luther was like the OG Protestant, right? So, he was the original bad boy, but it doesn't have that Lutherans are pretty chill. And even like so when I met evangelical Christians, I'm like, wow, this is a harder core version of this. A lot of that revolves around the fact that I'm gay, and so but my Lutheran pastor growing up going to church, like that was just not a big that
not a
was
big
not a
issue.
culture war thing. I remember being in like a communion class, a first communion class, and one of my classmates asked the pastor like if being gay was wrong because of the Bible, and he was like, well, the Bible says some things that are a little outdated, and let's not worry about that one too much, right? And I was like, "Oh, okay, that's cool." I wasn't like it was 13, like not thinking of these things at the time. But then, in high school, I started going to some like fun churches with all the fun songs, and those tend to be like pretty evangelical, more exciting, more fun than like the boring church, but more hardcore on the like homosexuality and culture wars and all that stuff. And I was like, uh, and so that then I really started to wrestle with some things. So and then going to UCLA and then getting wrapped up in some, very evangelical groups. I remember walking home one day from a science class because I was pre med with a classmate, and she said, we had just had a discussion in biology class about evolution, and she's like, "Well, none of that stuff is true, anyways." And I was like, "Excuse me, like." What are we talking about here? Like, what kind of group am I involved with?
So were you aware of yourself as a gay person in high school and early college when you were in that
Yeah.
state?
Yeah,
And
and then there was like, there were these I would participate in these like Bible study groups where they'd be like, "Oh, homosexuality is wrong." And I'm like, "Hold on." Like I had enough like self-awareness and like self-confidence from it hadn't been ingrained in me from like a very young age from this Lutheran church that, this was wrong. And I was like, I don't think I'll think Christians think that. So I actually like sought out other Christians. This was like, late 90s, early 2000s at UCLA. So there were like Methodist groups and Unitarian Universalist groups that were like, no, you can be Christian and like, homosexuality is fine. And, I sort of got back to, just more reason thinking about it.
so okay, so I got you at UCLA, and you're at one point you're studying to be a medical student, but you did go to law school.
Well, I was pre-med because when I decided on what career I wanted to be at the age of 10, the choices are lawyer, doctor, teacher, and I was like, well, success. I want to be successful and help people generally, so doctor. And I took all the classes and stuff, but I really had a passion for English. So I was an English major. I thought about, having done really well in the verbal parts of all the tests that I had taken. And I was like, why don't I just take a test? It's all verbal, which is the LSAT. And so I took that, did pretty well, and went to law school in the evening program at the University of Denver because I was living in Colorado then already. And there's two law schools. One of them has an evening program. That's how that's how I ended up as a lawyer.
Were you a news junkie? Were you were
Yeah.
you Were you interested in what was going on in politics,
Oh
and were you
yeah.
following all that stuff?
Yeah, I love news and politics. Ever since I was young, my dad was always like, "Oh, don't necessarily believe what you read in the paper, and think for yourself." And I just really liked specifically people having good arguments and good being able to convince each other with like valid points. Like that was really interesting to me. It was so I initially like started a blog where I would what really bothered me was people using like pithy generalizations to make their points, like the kind of things that people share on memes and bumper stickers, like even something like freedom isn't free, or like if guns kill people, then spoons make people fat, like.
It's funny, I saw one of those the other day.
Mhm.
It said, "War is not the answer."
Mhm.
And, like, from my background, I was like, "Oh, isn't that beautiful?" And then I'm thinking, if you're in
Mm.
Ukraine right now,
Right.
war kind of is the answer. Like,
Right.
it's either you fight or you get taken over. So I thought it is pithy, and it sounds, I guess,
Mhm.
what Jon Stewart used to call truthy,
Mhm.
like, or is it Colbert, one of those guys.
Colbert, yeah.
Yeah, but like, it's not true.
Right, and the more general it is, like, the more false it is. So the name of my original blog was called "All Generalizations Are False," and I thought I was, like, the one to come up with that. So, like, that's a generalization, which means it
Right.
itself is false, like, some generalizations are actually true. Uh, Somebody told me, like, actually Mark Twain came up with that. So I swear I didn't see it from him, but we were thinking of the same thing in the ether. Whatever. I'm happy to credit Mark Twain, but all generalizations are false. And it was on this idea that, like, yeah, the pithier your argument is, like, the less true it is. So, but people don't often have time for like longer arguments and teasing out analogies or
Yeah.
finding so I love analogies. I love that analogy section on the SAT, and the LSAT, where like this is like this and this is not like this, and that's where the whole like if guns kill people and spoons make people fat thing. I was like, that's just a terrible analogy, and let's talk about why. But fewer people want to read a 2,000 word essay on why that's a terrible analogy than want to share the pithy meme on Facebook.
So the seeds of your present work
Hmm.
were there. Like,
Yeah.
even at you're a salesperson, but you got this blog, and you're thinking about the news, and then you go to law school, and you become what kind of lawyer?
A patent lawyer. I ended up practicing a lot around software. Software was not my background. I never coded or anything, but I had to learn a lot about software because my clients were doing that.
So so at what point do you transition from all that stuff to what you're doing now?
So 2016, that election year, that was a magic moment for me because I was examining how people on Facebook, you're not on Facebook, you've missed out on all of this. Again, it's a good thing because so many people lost friends and family relationships, like they broke during the 2016 election. I mean, Hillary and Trump, like the level of vitriol online and in between, people who had otherwise had great relationships, just got turned up to an 11. And I noticed a thing that people would do with their Facebook arguments. They would share links to news sources that they thought were convincing to themselves. And they would share that with people who are their political opposites. And, no surprise, they didn't work. So somebody from the right would be like, oh, I'm right. Hillary is terrible because look at this article from Breitbart. And the person on the left would be like, well, I don't believe that because it's Breitbart. And then they say, look at this article. This says Donald Trump's a racist from HuffPost. And they're like, well, I don't believe HuffPost because it's liberal, and it was just really ineffective, right? But people are so convinced by their own media, and people would do worse things than that. They would share, YouTube conspiracy theory links, just really terrible sources of information. So uh, I thought, I was thinking about a couple things. The fact that people like short explanations, and like to share pictures and memes, and uh, people should know that like there are some news sources that are better, some that are worse, some that are okay, and there's some that are left and right. But then there are some that are really extremely so that are worse. They're not all the same just because they're left and right. And I thought, hey, a picture of like news media would be helpful. Like it would sort of um, hit all these things that I'd been thinking about. It would hit like the fact that people want to share things that are easily shareable and in picture format. Uh, as a patent lawyer, I knew that I would have to explain really complex ideas in lots of words, but also lots of pictures. And without the pictures, it's like really hard to understand all the words sometimes. So many of us are visual and auditory learners. So I spent some time putting together this like map of the media landscape and like thinking about, well, what does make a news source good in most people's eyes, and what makes it okay or really bad. What makes it left and right? Like what are the qualities of the actual content itself that makes it that way? And so I like to say this: I'm a huge nerd. So as a hobby, I would like work on this nights and weekends, and I actually drew the first version of the media bias chart in Microsoft Visio, which is the computer program that I use for doing patent drawings. And I used it because I didn't know how to use Photoshop. Like I'm not a graphic designer or anything like that else like that. I mean, first version was kind of ugly, but it was really, really, really popular. Like I put it online and it just
What
went
year was
massively
this? What
viral.
year was this?
This is a 2016. It was right before
2016.
the
Okay.
election.
So here's the thing. Couple thoughts that come to my mind is the first thing is I want to tell you that in my intro to this podcast, I'm going to insist that everybody go look at the media bias chart before they listen to the podcast. Otherwise, they won't know why.
Right.
Like podcasting is not a visual medium, and like so, I'm going to try to make sure that everybody knows what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But in a sense, it's really a pretty simple chart.
It is.
Because it goes left to right, charting left to right. How biased is somebody to the left? How biased is somebody to the right? And then up and down, it goes levels of reliability from the lowest reliability at the bottom to the highest reliability at the top. And it's kind of interesting to me, like it sort of forms almost a perfect bell curve.
Almost. Reliability and bias are highly, but not perfectly correlated. So there are some things that are like in the middle, and middle is not best. So, but people sometimes think that we're saying the middle is best because there is that high correlation. Because, if you think about a news source that's trying to be minimally biased and just report a lot of facts, having a lot of facts puts it at the top of the chart, and, being minimally biased puts it in the middle of the chart. So there's just a lot of overlap there. But middle can mean, it's either minimally biased, like I said, or centrist. Like centrist is actually a political position, so you can be biased towards centrism and end up in the middle. Or it can be balanced, like a balance of biases. So you can have, certain podcasts that, especially that have very left-leaning and very right-leaning guests on different podcasts, and it sort of shakes out to the middle. Doesn't mean it's necessarily the best. There's just balance.
So let me go back get a few words right, because left and right.
Yeah.
What's interesting is I used to think I knew what those words meant.
The more you think about it, the more you're not sure what they mean.
Yeah. What do they mean now? Like to you, because you're rating people, you're saying this is a really left wing or this is a really right wing. What does it mean? What defines somebody who's left wing right now or right wing?
So the left-right spectrum used to initially say liberal and conservative, but that's a bit is not as broad as left and right. Left and right are broader because within conservative you have or within right you have libertarian, and then like more traditional conservative, and then you have folks that call themselves alt-right or neoconservatives. On the left you have like neoliberals or classical liberals, left liberals as we define them in the United States, or progressives, which are further left than that. So, left and right.
And you even have anarchists, don't you? Wouldn't they go all the way over there? Or are
Right.
they not there?
Right, if people identify as like democratic socialists or socialists, or it would be further left. Anarchists, you could make an argument that would be like the furthest left, possibly. It's sort of like the extremes sort of meet and overlap in some senses. But
in terms of this, like I used to think that, and maybe I'm still right, or maybe I never was, that conservative, one of the things that characterized them was a great suspicion of government, big government. Many, the conservatives wanted less government programming, less taxation, a smaller government, and liberals were more people that favored a bigger government, and they were more suspicious of corporate power. And does that attitude about government and attitude about corporate power, do those things figure into this?
Yes, but left and right, really, it covers so many concepts. So here's how we think about this. Okay, our left-right spectrum is it's anchored in a couple of principles. One, it's three main ones. It's U.S., it's contemporary, and it's based on positions of elected officials. So let's go through those one by one. U.S. The left-right spectrum in the U.S. is not the same as it is in Canada, France, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, right? It's just not. It's not the same region by region. So we have to sort of bucket it and say, okay, this is a U.S. based media bias chart because we're U.S. analysts looking at U.S. news content, right? You have to frame it somewhere. It's contemporary because what's left and right changes over time. People refer to the concept of the Overton window in terms of like how dialogue shifts, what's acceptable dialogue, and so that's a related concept. Like what's left and right shifts over time, and we're trying to measure the media. We're not measuring people, right? We're measuring media content, like the words that are being produced in print, on air, etc. Right? And so, since we're measuring that, we have to benchmark it against something else within our American society that is left and right. And so, you can try to say, like, well, there's really three options. You can go off of like positions of elected officials. You could go off the media itself. You could go off of like what people in society generally think, right? But since we're measuring the media, we can't anchor it on the media. Measuring what generally people think, like via polling and stuff, is a bit squishy, right? The most measurable thing we can anchor it on is the positions of current elected officials, because we can document the things that they say and do in terms of policy actions and positions. They say that things on social media, on TV, in their platforms, their speeches, their
and they
public
vote.
events. Yeah, and they vote on their policies and actions. So we measure on that. Now you covered a couple of different topics, just in terms of like what's liberal and conservative, in terms of like government spending and corporate power, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many issues upon which we can we can cast something left or right. Guns, abortion, race, taxes, K through 12 education, defense spending, immigration. It just there's
states' rights. Yeah,
long list, right? So when we're measuring content, we are looking, usually a piece of content isn't talking about like 52 issues. Usually a piece of content is talking about like one issue or maybe two or three related issues. So each issue you can think of like as on a left to right spectrum. So we have our analysts, like we have analysts from left, right, and center, and we have them self-rate according to these various positions. And people are complex. And usually people aren't like, I'm completely right-wing or I'm completely left-wing on everything. People have nuanced views on all those things I mentioned, on race and abortion and immigration, et cetera. So we have them like label themselves one by one, because when we're looking at an article, we're going to say, on abortion, is this article left leaning or right leaning or center, based on what we know about like the current U.S. left right on abortion.
Okay. So you mentioned the we,
Mm-hmm.
and so that first one, that first one in
Yeah.
2016, was that you like in your basement
Just me.
making all the judgments yourself?
Yeah, which is super biased, right? Because it's just me.
Oh
So,
yeah.
yeah.
It's funny because I saw an article from 2016 about this, and it says now the liberals have a way of like, and it was accusing you of rating the media like pretending to be objective, but you're really just a liberal shill. And
Yes, I'm the liberals.
but it sounds like at this stage in the game, how early on did you realize that it couldn't be a one person show?
Oh, I got that feedback like pretty immediately. People were like, "Well, you're biased." I'm like, "Well, yeah, that's true." So how do I make this less biased? And I knew I would have to have multiple people. And at first, I didn't think this was going to be like this. I didn't think I was going to start a company and leave my lawyer career to do this. That's where we are now. But I just worked on it by myself, and I just took feedback from folks online. And I got a lot of feedback from folks online, as you can imagine. People have opinions on like, well, CNN is too high or too low or too left or too right. And then, folks on the left would be like, oh, this is too far right. And people on the right would say, oh, this is too far left. And so I had a sense that like it was in the ballpark, right? I was in the general area.
Well,
But
and did you? I would think you also got a lot of feedback that was going like, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much.
yes,
I struggle so much to know whether who to trust in terms of reliability, and also to know like if an article comes from, I mean, Breitbart's easy,
right.
right? And so is HuffPost for that
Sure.
matter. But like somebody, like, can I trust this outlet? Can I trust that? Do I know where they're coming from? And so you must have just gotten so many people going like, thank you. You are the answer to my prayers.
Yeah, that I think that's why it got so popular because we're in this moment where people are like, I don't know what to trust. People are just overwhelmed by the sheer number of information sources. And this is a fairly new problem. Like, we didn't used to have tens of thousands of information sources, literally tens of thousands. I mean, this is a problem that's new as of like the last 12 to 15 years. And yeah, I had so many people saying, "Oh, I'm just gonna stay up in the green box." So like, there's a little green box at the top, minimally least biased, highest reliability news sources. And there's a ton in there, and folks would look at it. I mean, even folks that were like news savvy, but they were getting all of their news from left leaning opinion or right leaning opinion. That opinion content is not the same as news. And they were not differentiating between it. They're like, okay, I'm a lot more sane when I just, focus on stuff that is least bias and more fact reporting.
Is there, and where I'm going with this, because again, I have this audience of people
Yeah,
that are trying to figure out how to make the most of their lives. Like this is the one that we've got. How do I be a good person?
it's a great
They're sort of,
question.
and they've sort of committed themselves to like, I think the way to make the most of my life is to love other people and to do stuff that makes things better for other people
Yeah.
and to cultivate gratitude.
Hmm.
And of course, if you're trying to do those things, the news cycle is not necessarily the most inspiring place to be.
Right.
But a lot of us are sort of asking the question, what should I be like? How much should I be consuming news? What news should I be consuming? Um, what's the what's the what makes me a good citizen? What makes me a good friend? And so in this kind of context, I think what I'm wondering is, okay, so you're helping people figure out what where things lie on that
Hmm.
spectrum.
Hmm.
Is there a reason why somebody would say it's important if you want to be a good person, you need to read a little Breitbart once in a while, or you need to read a little bit of hyper left wing stuff because otherwise you're not. You need to know you're reading propaganda, but you need to read it. Do you find any value in not just staying in the green box? Do you
Yes.
go outside the green box?
Oh yeah, and it's a great exercise. So we actually really encourage this for all the reasons you mentioned. Um, you know, being and I love the question that you're exploring, like how to make the most of your life. Like you've got one shot, right? The one shot that we know of. So let's make the most out of it. And generally, like leaving the world better than you found it, making a difference for others, like loving others. I think that's something that it sounds like you and your audience is aligned around. And the information we consume and how it has us interrelate to others in our society and our families is a big part of that because we're getting information from somewhere. So, first off, want to issue the idea of like, just blocking out all news because it's negative or like makes us feel bad or what have you. Like, we have to get information from somewhere. And even if people say like, oh, I would just ignore the news. I mean, you're getting like information seeps into your like awareness from somewhere, whether it's just like overhearing somebody's conversation. So to be like responsibly informed, I think is step one, and that's like where the least bias, right?
I don't think anybody's going to argue with you on like, listen, it's important to be responsibly informed. Help me now. Help me.
Yeah. So start with like, for your own news consumption, like just to know what's going on in the world and like how it affects you and how you can affect other people. Least bias, most reliable. Yes, of course. But what you mentioned is like, reading something that's like your political opposite from time to time, or your political extreme on your own side. Here's why that's helpful. Okay. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, you or somebody where you walk into a room and the cable news channel that you hate the most is playing, and you say or someone else says, "Oh, just turn that off. I can't even stand to listen to that garbage." Right? When we are presented with information that contradicts our beliefs, it's a natural defense mechanism to like want to shut it out and expel it, and it actually makes us like feel sick to consume it. So my analysts, we have left, right, and center analysts, like I mentioned before. I warned them that the first couple weeks of doing this work, they're actually going to feel sick listening to content, really extreme right wing or left wing content that's opposite from them, because it's a visceral reaction. It just like literally makes you feel bad. Um, but you get over that.
And you've developed no tolerance for it because you've kept it out of your life.
Yeah, exactly. But it's really important to know, like, I remember when I first had this experience, like I wanted to rate all the cable news shows, so I had to watch all the cable news shows, and I would watch some of it and be like, now I understand why half the country is like this, right? Because if you're consuming, like, I've never consumed this content, but somebody else, this is all the content they consume. This is like their whole world. This is true to them. So now I have a window into somebody else's world and their truth and their reality. And that's a great place to start because think of like the quintessential example, Thanksgiving dinner example, where you have so many conservative, liberal family members, and then one of the people says something that's like a pretty standard to them, conservative or liberal talking point, and it sounds just so shocking and offensive to somebody else that's never heard it before, right? So one, it's sort of like inoculation. If you hear somebody's conservative or liberal talking point that you like really disagree with, but it's not the first time you've heard of it, you're going to be like less shocked and angry when you hear it, and you will have some like sort of mental preparation, and perhaps like an argument in your back pocket, to like discuss that particular point. If you've never heard it before,
Yeah.
you're just like you're shocked, you're angry, and you're like, no, that's not true. But yeah.
And you know what? So often the first thing you say is, how can you possibly think that? How could you
Exactly.
possibly believe that? And that's that puts somebody so on the defensive.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're basically saying you'd have to be an idiot to believe that.
Yes.
And the truth is that when you hear it on Fox News or on the other side on, with CNN, is that the other sort of the
and MSNBC, yeah.
MSNBC? That's the one, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You go like, oh, I can see how you could believe that. I can see
Yeah.
how you could, yeah. That makes okay.
If somebody said it to you 100 times, of
Yeah.
course you might believe that, right? It might resonate with you. It's an argument that like appeals to your moral foundations already, and it's like really not that far off base. So yeah, it just creates a lot more understanding when you can expose yourself to that the arguments from the other side.
So you're saying that the diet should have some centrist, like some stuff at the
Mhm.
high level of reliability and the
Right.
high level of
The
the
least
low
bias,
level of
yeah.
bias. Yeah, the least bias, the most reliable. But you're like, you also ought to season that diet with some stuff coming from the extremes
Mhm.
so that you have some basis of understanding of some of the people you're going to encounter in the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, uh, every week, we sell media literacy programs to schools, and we have this exercise called Topic of the Week, where it's just like rate these articles like Ad Fontes media analysts would rate them for bias and reliability, just article by article. And so we'll pick like 6 articles from you know across the media landscape, left, right, center, high, low, reliability, about the same topic, and you just see like the same news topic, just completely alternate realities on one side or the other. And that's like, it's important to know that.
But I understand how you can relate bias, how you can rate bias.
Hmm.
Reliability, how do you, isn't, don't you have to wait 6 months to see if, like, were they telling the truth? Like, how like if I just pick up an article, I can tell the bias of it, but I can't tell if there really were 7 school children that were um that were called racist names, or if that was made up. I don't know.
Right.
How do you know?
So just like bias, the more you think about it, the more like you feel like you don't know what you're talking about it. But look, philosophers have wrestled with the question of like, how do we know what we know since the beginning of philosophy, right? It's like epistemology, the study of how we know what we know. And we, unfortunately, I think the way that we're taught about like truth and opinion in school, like we're taught it at a very young age, and it's very like binary and simple. Like, true or false, the sky is blue. Like, true or false, like George Washington was a first president. And a lot of things are just like in the middle, like they're neither true nor false, or like they're mostly true, or mostly false, or there's like a likelihood of truth. And it's not just truth, right? There's how articles are expressed. Now, we also think of this in sort of a simplistic binary, like fact versus opinion, or news versus opinion. So the examples that we learn when we're in school is, fact is George Washington was the first president, and an opinion is I like broccoli. And you know there are gradients of those things. It's not just people talk about news and opinion, but so much of our content is actually something in the middle, which is analysis. Like, you have fact reporting at the top, then you have analysis in the middle, which is a lot of our news landscape, and then you have opinion.
What's the difference between analysis and opinion?
Density of facts used to support the conclusions. So let's go through that. Like, our definition of reliability is a very specific definition. Okay, so reliability, it's how much can you rely on a source or an article to be truthfully and factfully, widely and thoroughly informed about new information that affects you and others. Okay, so I won't go through all of those, but factfully, like not just factually, like literally full of facts. The density of facts in an article is a really big clue as to the overall
It's an
reliability.
indicator.
It's an indicator.
7:05 p.m. it happened. It was at this corner. These people were there.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Like the who, what, when, where, but not the why. The why is not a fact, right? The why is a conclusion, it's an inference, it's a statement of meaning. Sometimes, in addition to those things, we have predictions about the future, and the more out there in the future it is, the more it's like speculation. So we have various different sub factors for measuring reliability, and so a main sub factor is the expression. Is it expressed as fact? Like, is it listing out a bunch of facts in sequence, who, what, when, where? Is it expressed as analysis, where you've got like fact, fact, and a conclusion, right? Fact, fact, this is what it means. Opinions are just mostly like conclusions, just things that are like, they are, um, maybe they're provable, maybe they're disprovable. An example would be like somebody says government corruption is absolute. Okay, is that true? Like, well, I mean, you could find like examples that support that, and you could find examples that disprove that, right? So that's what we tend to call opinion. But that's when somebody says that, we take that as well, we should take that as opinion.
So there may be facts that would support it, but I'm not quoting any.
Yeah,
I'm just
exactly. We're
okay.
just going straight to the
Right.
generalization. We're going
Yeah.
straight to the conclusion.
Okay. So that's helpful. That's really helpful to me. Now, as it's funny when you talk about fact checkers. I'm just going to impress you here. I
Sure.
was once profiled by the New York Times Magazine.
I read that. It was impressive.
Yeah. Thank you. That's the only article that's ever been written about me that,
But it was in the New York Times, so
it was a very exciting paper of record, right?
Yeah.
Legit journalist wrote that article. So as he's writing it, I get a call from the fact checker from the New York Times, who's sort of like, can you tell me the address of the McDonald's restaurant where this story took place? And I mean, she was just down to it. And I'm thinking like, this is just a puff piece about like a nice guy who works with college students. But I was impressed by that.
Yeah.
And I was listening to Cameron Crowe, the filmmaker, talking about making Almost Famous, that when he was writing for the New York Times as a young person, he was always getting hassled by the fact checkers. And the interviewer said, fact checkers? Who has fact check? Like, whose blog has a fact checker? Like, he's like, most of the information that we're consuming today, nobody's checking the facts.
Right. And I wish more people understood that about how journalism is created. People who know that are people who have like maybe taken journalism class, right? Or people who have been interviewed
Right.
and had to field the fact checking calls. Yeah, I remember the first time a fact checker called me for an article. I had the same experience, and that's a standard practice at most reputable, like longstanding, large enough organizations. But there are tens of thousands of public information sources that are not that. Like it doesn't take any fact checkers, like you said, to put up a blog. I mean, you can have one or two people put out a ton of content on the internet with no fact checking at all. So
and it can look really good. It can have a really good masthead. And I mean, that stuff can look so reliable.
Yeah. And like, how do we, I'll jump to like, how do we do it? Because I talked about the expression, fact, analysis, opinion, but veracity is a different thing. It's like something can be expressed as fact, but it's completely untrue. Like, what do you do then? Right. And you asked about like, well, how do I know that, I forget the example that seven children were called a name.
Were called racist names. Yeah.
Right. How do you know that? So we have to. We don't realize how much we rely on others that are closer to the information than us to get information, because we live in a world of now 8 billion people. Now, how do I know that? Was I counting that there's like 8 billion people? No, I read it in a bunch of news articles today that like the world's population has crossed 8 billion. But like, think about, how do I actually know that, and how do I know that it's true? Well, like, I personally don't. Like, I personally have not counted, right? But I am relying on a network of information professionals whose job it is to like get me that information, and that includes like demographers, across the world, and then the journalists who collect the information from those demographers to repeat it to me, right? So how do I make like a valid judgment on whether that's true or not? Oh, I have to rely on a bunch of different signals and heuristics, and we're doing this all the time. We just don't like really realize that we're doing it.
What does that mean?
It's a shortcut.
Is that like a shortcut? Is that all it means?
It's a shortcut. Mm-hmm.
Mental shortcut.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I think that's what we do. We do like, it's funny because sometimes they fail us. Like, one of my heuristics growing up was, if somebody speaks with a Southern accent, they're not that smart.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned in college,
Mm-hmm.
that's not actually a reliable way of figuring out who's smart.
It's not. And we have these tools for figuring out like what's true, and sometimes we over rely on them, and they don't serve us well. So, like an easy acronym for remembering the things that we rely on is RELI, rely. Okay? Reputation, evidence, likelihood, and incentives. Okay. So evidence and likelihood are the best ones. Okay. Evidence is the best. Likelihood really helps a lot too. Reputation and incentives are sort of the worst ones, but they're the ones we rely on the most. Just because that's usually like where we have like the reputation of the New York Times or the reputation of Breitbart or the reputation of HuffPost, right? We feel like we know those from those sources, but then what happens if you don't have never heard of the source? I can't go on reputation anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, it's funny, until the 2016 election, I relied on the New York Times so heavily
Mm-hmm.
because I thought they were unbiased.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that they're not as biased as but like, I felt like the New York Times saw Trump coming and they were like, we're from New York. We know this is bad. And they just like, we're going to set aside our unbiased thing for this election. And we're going to try to take this guy down.
And that was like jarring for folks. Another thing that's jarring is like people don't know really how to sort predictions. So, like predictions about polling, people were like, "Well, the New York Times lied because their polling said that Hillary was going to win." Like, well, were they wrong, or were they giving you percentages, right? So, with the best book on this and on decision making of like how to determine like what's true when you don't have all the information, I think is actually the subtitle of this book. The title of the book is called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, who's a poker player. You
Oh,
should
yeah, yeah,
interview her
no.
if you have a chance.
I heard her on an interview and she was fabulous.
Oh my gosh, that book is amazing. But it talks about these like percentages, right?
Yeah.
Like if somebody says like, Hillary has a 90% or 95% chance of winning, it means that like if 5% of the time she could lose, right? And so people look at that and say, the 5% happened, they were wrong. It's like, no, it was a probability.
Oh, that's good. That's exactly a great way to explain it because, yeah, if I said she's 95% going to win, she could lose,
Yeah, but we conflate those
and
two.
she
Like
did.
we conflate those two in our head. We're like it was wrong, it was a lie, and that's just not the case.
Okay, so I'm going to jump, okay?
Yeah.
Because you were talking about the I being incentive.
Incentives.
And I keep thinking, like, you're rating all these news sources on their bias and on their reliability. But I've got a third thing that's worrying me, and that is I'm aware that all of these news outlets make money by getting people to watch them
Mm-hmm.
or read them, which means that they're incentivized to tell the stories that will get me to watch rather than necessarily the stories that are the most important.
Mm-hmm.
So, some sensational like Kim Kardashian goes to see Trump in the White House, and that's a story. I don't know that that's actually one of the most important political stories of that day, but boy, that girl looks really interesting standing at the desk. And so that's what they do. And so I feel like we live in an environment where most of our news sources are on ad revenue models
Mm-hmm.
where they just want to get you. Their primary concern is not to tell you the truth. Their primary concern is to get you to watch.
Yeah, I mean they're balancing incentives too. The reason why incentives is just a poor heuristic is because there's so many competing ones, and there's so many. And if you over rely on them, then like it's just a bad signal, right? So if you say that like the so and so is just telling you this to make money. Yes, but like we all do things for money. That doesn't mean that we don't also do things for other reasons.
Yeah.
And like every organization is owned by something or someone. Somebody has to be making some money somewhere. So like people always ask about like the ownership, and ownership is like again, I don't even have it on the list because it's like such a poor heuristic. It's you say like, oh, it's owned by a big corporation and therefore X. Like the bigger the corporation is, the more people it has, and the frontline journalists don't necessarily have the same incentives as the top line executives, right? So like incentives are there's just so many competing ones that if you just say if you make it so simplistic, saying they're only telling you this because they want money, you're just going to
Well,
fall short. You're going to miss
I'm not
something.
so much worried about that they're going to lie to me within the story. I'm worried that they're going to tell me the stories that will get me to buy the paper. And so they might be very reliable in what they're telling me, but they're making editorial choices for financial reasons. It's a slightly different incentive thing
It is.
And that's what I guess, because when I pick up different newspapers, especially when I go overseas, if I read a paper there, they're just like, the world they're reporting on is completely different.
That has a lot. You're right. There's so much incentive in terms of like revenue, and not just ad revenue, but subscription revenue to like get people to come back and spend money. So people refer to like the golden age in journalism, where journalism has not always been like unbiased or biased. Has gone through these waves. Like initial newspapers, things are called the counting like the Democrat or the Republican because they used to be like partisan actual newspapers. And then there was a period of time where getting the biggest audiences meant like having not alienating anybody and like providing news that everyone could rely on. So we did have this golden age of journalism where you have the biggest audiences by having news for everyone. Now we've gone away from that because we have such fragmented media landscape, and people can like listen to the news that they like and they agree with, and that creates these incentives for people to create stuff that like just their audience wants, right? So if you look at like Washington Post, pretty much no matter what, like the politics horse race stuff is the stuff that's at the top.
That's where they're at.
And that's like even more so than like New York Times or Wall Street Journal. It's a little bit more subtle. New York Times would tend to cover like more like world events would be higher, whereas like Wall Street Journal would tend to have finance events higher up on the masthead, right? But if you read The Economist or some international like BBC or Al Jazeera that focuses on like international news, then you see much different stories that are up at the top, right?
Yeah.
And reputable publications, they're always trying to balance like, we know these things get more clicks and views, and we want to also be reputable and bring you like the important information. So it's the publications themselves struggle with this. It's like I use this analogy all the time of like junk news being like junk food, and for a long time, like even today, producers of junk food, they're in that position because one, it's profitable to produce junk food, and people like it, right? So people like fat, salt, and sugar. It's cheap for them to make, and they're like, well, we're just giving the people what they want, right? But it's sort of this vicious cycle where like, yes, people want it, but it's also really bad for them, right?
Yeah.
When you have folks that are thinking a little bit more like long term, but what's good for them in terms of their food consumption and their media consumption, people realize, it would be better for me to consume like news content that was healthier, more fact-based, less biased, even though like this opinion clickbait stuff is very satisfying, gives me that dopamine hit. I'm going to go and choose the better news. And then you do have some publishers that are trying to fill that need.
Okay, so I'm going to try to do a jujitsu trick here where like I'm going to bend something you just said with something else you just said and ask a question that's burning on me. When you started this out, one of the things that you noticed was that most people were getting their news not directly from the news source, but filtered to them through their social media.
Right.
And I think that's even more true today.
Mm-hmm.
That people don't actually read the New York Times. They see an article from the New York Times on somebody's, oh my gosh, did you see this? Or from Breitbart or from Al Jazeera or from wherever. And so it's a big filter.
Right.
The New York Times, and so that's happening. And that's like, and what's funny is like, I don't do any of that, but sometimes I look at Yahoo, and Yahoo's picked 8 stories. And they're not the 8 most important stories. They're the stories that Yahoo thinks I will be most likely to click on.
Yes.
Or YouTube. Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm.
Like I open up to YouTube to see a video of a soccer game highlights I want to see. And boy, they know me like a book. And so I got all these filters.
Mm-hmm.
And I go like, I think it's dangerous to let those corporations' algorithms choose which news stories.
Absolutely.
I also think it's dangerous to let Uncle Joe from Wyoming pick what news stories I listen to. So I think I'm better off like going to actual outlets. So here's my question, Vanessa.
Yeah.
I want to be a vibrant human being. I want to spend time with children and teach them valuable things. I want to hike and be healthy. I want to spend time with my wife. So I'm going to give like, if I had a half hour a day
Mm-hmm.
to be a news, to consume news that would help me understand the world in the way that would be the most, that would be the most healthy. I'll just use a very broad term, like healthy for me as a human.
Mm-hmm.
What would you tell me to do?
Well, fortunately, there are organizations that have tried to like step into this space, right? Everyone, as you mentioned, like you have all these competing needs as like a human to meet, and so you're really only going to have time for maybe like 3 to 5 news sources a day, right? And you hit the nail on the head. You don't want your habits to be driven by, you don't want your news consumption to be driven by one, habit, or two, algorithm, or even worse, habits that's developed by algorithm. And that's what so many people got in the habit of doing. Like I had noticed that like I had discovered, partisan sites that I liked through Facebook, and then I started visiting them every day. Like those were the 3 that I visited, and they were all kind of the same as each other and had the same thoughts, right? So today there are some good solutions out there. One, like I would like news apps for a few like minimally biased, highest reliability sources, like AP News. Great app to like have on your phone. AP is one of the largest journalism organizations in the world. Has over 2,000 journalists plus a bunch of stringers like worldwide. That's like by far and away one of the biggest.
And they rank high both in veracity
Yeah.
and also in terms of they're very balanced.
Yeah. Yes. And then your local news is important because it's like your local community. So do you have what do you think is in Cincinnati is your, like the best local paper?
Well, the only really significant local paper that actually has a staff that goes out there is the Cincinnati Enquirer. It's very right wing.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of the challenges of local news today. Unfortunately, we do
Especially in
have
a little city like mine.
we do have some news deserts. So there are also some really great some great email newsletters. So there's one called 1440 that pulls news. It's highly curated, like minimally biased, and links to news sources from a variety of other reliable sources. Okay, so just within that one digest, you'll get like a daily digest. There are a few other reputable publications like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and Politico like have good daily digests.
What's the most reliable right wing, right leaning?
Right leaning? I would say the Wall Street Journal.
Wall Street Journal? Okay.
Yeah.
And what's the most reliable left leaning? Would that be the New York Times?
Yeah, I would say the New York Times. And those are like fun, and people will criticize both of those heavily and be like, "Oh, it's owned by Rupert Murdoch. Oh, it's all the liberal complaints about the New York Times." Look, some of these are like functions of the things that we've touched on. They have fact checking and like they have real staffs of journalists. Those are 2 of the largest actual journalism organizations covering national news in the United States. They have the most resources. That makes a big difference in what they're able to bring to you. Okay.
Oh yeah.
For international, like the Economist, just start by like scouring that news landscape. Like our chart is actually a pretty good resource because this is not an exhaustive list. Like there are other really great publications out there. Like ProPublica is a great publication. Does investigative journalism. Again, nothing out there is perfect, like without mistakes or anything. But the higher it is on our list for reliability, there's again great podcasts, and there are podcasts that just are 10 minutes of the news. Like that's all. They're just headlines. And there's a Fox News podcast. It's just like I forget exactly what it's called. I think it's called like Fox Hourly Update. And people are sort of like shocked that it's up there. They're like, well, this is Fox. How can this possibly be so reliable? Well, it's literally 5 minutes of just headlines. It's like minimally biased, and it's nothing like primetime Fox opinion commentary. So the format like go to our chart. I keep telling
Yeah.
people, so we have an interactive media bias chart online that you can just like literally type in a name of any of the thousands of sources we have rated, and it'll pop up and show you
Oh my.
where it is.
Okay, I
Um,
didn't see that one. That's
yeah.
great.
So
That's great to
yeah.
know. Hey, so on behalf of your father, um, I feel like, you've kind of, it feels like you're doing it in the sense of, he said, "Hey, don't trust everything." And you've got this whole team. Are most of the people that are doing the judgments for you, are they mostly volunteers,
Nope.
or are they,
They're all paid.
you're paying them all. You're
Yep.
paying all these people.
Yep.
I guess the other part of it that I would say is that, you wanted to be a doctor because you wanted to help people. And I feel like this is terrifically helpful. Not just this conversation, but like when I look at the project, I go like, this is really important work, and I think it does make the world a better place.
Thank you. That's what I'm shooting for. I mean, the reason I left my law practice was not because I hated that job. That was a good job. It like paid really well, and it was
Yeah.
like quite a wonderful career. But I feel like I could change the world, and I
S-
feel like we are
a-
changing the world for the better.
And if you achieved it all, if
Mhm.
this project did what it was supposed to do,
Mhm.
what would be the outcome for you? Like what's the what's the landscape that you want to see? Surely it's not this one.
Right. So I think we eventually we evolve to the place where we can handle all the information that's out there. Like we're currently in this like growing pains stage where like we have more information available to us than we really know how to deal with and consume. And that's happened before in history with the printing press, right?
Hmm.
With radio, there were these initial freakouts about like this new form of communication, but ultimately more interpersonal communication is like a net benefit to society, but then there's like these growing pains, and we're in this current growing pain stage. So ultimately, news consumers just being able to sort the information for themselves into like what's reliable, unreliable, highly biased, less biased. You'll just see people like, you know, young people today will have these skills when they're older. Um, and also because of that, the demand for the misinformation and the extreme polarizing content will fade away. So it's going to be like um, it's going to be like a slow like evolution, or like won't happen overnight, but then one day you'd be like, remember when we had all that fake news and like super partisan stuff, like what was that all about? Like we were in a crazy mode there, and it'll be because like we've helped people sort through the media landscape.
That I mean, it's funny. I was listening. I was like, wow, this woman consumes more news than I've even thought about,
It's a lot.
and she's still like optimistic. Like that, because I mean, there's tremendous optimism in what you're saying. And you're saying, like, if we make people literate and we help them to understand what they're consuming,
Mhm.
they'll choose to consume the stuff
Mhm.
that is the healthiest for our society. And I don't know if that's true, but boy, it's a hopeful thought.
I have lots of good reasons for this optimism. One of them I see every day in my analyst shift. So we have like 40 people who are left, right, and center. Like we have staunch conservatives and staunch progressives, and they sit together in rooms on Zoom, going over articles about the most polarizing topics in America today. Like race and Trump and religion and abortion and guns, right? And they agree and they have respectful conversations because they, disdain extremism on their own side. They value the connection with the other person, like above all else, and they feel like they're doing something to fix society. The other reason for optimism, it's like so like it can be done, like with like polarized humans in the United States. It just like takes work.
Wait, can I interrupt you just
Yeah.
for a second? That's a lovely image. It kind of reminds me of all these rooms that I've been in where you have like ardent believers in God
Hmm.
and lovely secular humanists. And whenever you have lovely believers and lovely non-believers talking very long, invariably the believers end up non-believers, because it just, if you just turn down the volume and just think about the ideas, the ideas tend to take people that way in a conversation. Do you find that happens in your room? Like, are those ardent people on the post? Like, do people change as a result of working for your organization, and they find themselves drifting in a direction?
Well, I wouldn't say that, like, they change from, like, left to right or right to left,
No.
like, consistently one way. I would say that, folks, and they end up being able to agree on, like, fairly moderate positions, like, actually policy positions and actions, and that's not a thing that, like, we see a lot in our elected representatives, right?
Right.
So you might start out with, like, uh, I I know that if we got our, left and right analysts together, and we don't have them do this, we have them write articles, but we've said, all right, if you two had to, like, come up with, like, a compromise policy position for everybody in America to live under regarding guns, right? What would you come up with? And it would end up being, like, fairly moderate position, just because, like, the volume
Yeah.
is turned down, and, like, the fact, like, having to deal with the fact that it's a complex issue, and that there are multiple people who have to live under this, with competing values, having to follow the same rules. um, it, it ends up shaking out that way.
So in a sense, that sort of almost bell curve that I
Hmm.
see when I look at the chart, it feels like if you turn down the volume and you really focus on the facts, you get
Hmm.
to a high level of reliability that moderates people. Like, it's almost like the truth is an argument for moderation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it makes sense if you think about, like, look, half the people in the country think one thing, and half the people think in the country think a total opposite thing. Like, is it? What are the chances that, like, one side is completely wrong on everything and the other side is completely right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, the likelihood there is just low, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This all reminds me of sort of my patron saint of this stuff is a guy named Jonathan Haidt,
Oh
um,
yeah, righteous mind.
The Righteous Mind. And
It's required reading for my analysts.
is it really?
It is.
That makes me feel even more confident
It's part of our
because
training, actually.
I mean, it's funny because, like, in my humanist group at USC, it was
Mhm,
almost required reading. Those kids passed that around like it was a Bible
mhm.
because it was this really cogent argument for the idea that our society actually needs people to to some be more adverse to risk and others be very risk takers. It needs people to be conservative and people to be liberal, because the best ideas do not come when everybody's moderate. The best ideas come when people are talking across that boundary in a civil way.
Yes.
And so it sounds like that's what I mean. It sounds like your company is almost like a, a microcosm of
Mhm.
that kind of thought.
Yeah, and like, I don't want it to sound like, being moderate and centrist is, like, always, like, the way. I've long thought that, like, liberals need progressives, and, like, moderate conservatives need, like, further right conservatives, just because, they need to, like, remind each other. So, like, the folks on the, that are sort of pushing the envelope, are real close to, like, certain values. Like, for, you know, progressives, the uh, folks are very progressive about, like, like, human rights issues, like, the transgender human rights, or, like, racial human rights, often are, like, very close to, like, the problem they're experiencing in their lives, and, like, how much human impact something has, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, like, a moderate liberal, like, yes, they agree, but
The
um,
passion isn't there.
the passion isn't there. They need to be reminded by the
Yeah.
progressive, but the progressive also needs, like, the more moderate liberal, because the more moderate liberal is just in a better position to talk to somebody on the other side that they can actually move policy forward with.
Yeah. Boy, that's well said. I'm just going to stop it right there. That's just a really, I mean, I mean, really, this conversation's given me a lot of hope.
That's what I'm out here for.
Well, I mean, I think you're doing, like I said, I think you're doing a really good work, and and I'm grateful for it. And I really, thanks a lot for taking the time to talk with me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I get the compliment sometimes, like, you're doing God's work, and
So do I. Believe it or not, all my ex-Christian friends are like, they always say, like, I think you're an anonymous Christian. I think that, like, later on you'll find that all that you were doing was really guided by the Holy Spirit. Because the right kind
Maybe
of Christians, whenever they see love or care or kindness, they claim it. They go like, somehow that has to do with us. And there's something good about that somebody who's so confident in their worldview that they're like, if there's good out there, we've got it somehow it comes back to our truth.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's an empowering way to look at the world.
Yeah. I wish there were some way I mean, you've been really helpful to me. I don't know if there's any way I can ever be helpful to you, but I want you to feel like you've made a friend today.
I do feel like I've met a friend, and you know what? Just getting the word out about what we do, and having it if it reaches somebody new that finds out about what we do and has it help them, that's a big help already.
All right, that was me and Vanessa Otero. I hope you dug it. I really like talking to her. I really think we're a little bit farther down the road towards having a good media diet, having a good news diet, at least that part of our media diet. We could talk about reality TV and sports and all that other stuff another time, but the news part of it, I feel pretty good about right now. And hey, it turns out she's a deconverted Lutheran, humanist, just like us. We're not all deconverted Lutherans, but here we are, trying to humanize ourselves, trying to make the world a better place. And we found another one. So there, have a great day, and I'll see you next time on Humanize Me.
This podcast is made possible by supporters of the show on Patreon. Get an exclusive extra episode every month for less than the cost of a cup of coffee at patreon.com/humanize me. You'll also get a video newsletter from Bart and some extra goodies. Our patrons make this show happen, so please, if you enjoy it, consider joining us. That's patreon.com/humanize me. Bart's website, where you can contact him, is bartcampolo.org. And this episode is produced by Katie Johnson-Smith, me, John Wright, and Bart Campolo.
You could be larger than life.